So now that we've seen the circulatory organization found in generic fish, it's time to take things to the next level by looking at the circulatory organization in an interesting category of fish, our air-breathing fish. So air-breathing fish have an alternate circuitry relative to non-air-breathing fish. Basically, in the air-breathing fish, oxygenated blood from the air-breathing fish's air-breathing organ winds up going into the systemic venous vasculature. So just to map this onto our initial circuitry diagram here, right? So what we're talking about is the systemic venous vasculature, so the lower right portion of this circulatory diagram, okay? What this means is that the oxygen source from that oxygenated blood is in parallel with the systemic circulation, right? So it's not in series with systemic circulation, it's in parallel. So let me show you what I mean by that with two different examples. Remembering that, as I highlighted when we were talking about respiratory function, air-breathing fish have evolved to use a wide range of different organs as their primary air-breathing organ. So the ways that they have modified circulatory function can vary as well as the ways in which they've modified to be able to breathe air. So the upper diagram that's illustrated here, right, shows the air-breathing organ taking blood that comes from the heart, so it's pumped out by the heart, right? Normally that would be deoxygenated in a non-air-breathing fish. So some of that blood gets diverted into the mouth, their air-breathing organ. In that organ, that blood's going to become oxygenated, okay? So, and then that oxygenated blood is going to return to the heart. It's going to mix with the deoxygenated blood coming from the systemic tissues. So in this type of air-breathing fish, now suddenly, circumstances don't suck quite as badly for the heart anymore because the heart's now getting partially reoxygenated blood as a result of receiving some oxygenated blood that has passed through the air-breathing organ, okay? So, collectively, this is helpful, but as I note over here on the left-hand side, because of this mixing, the oxygen saturation in the blood leaving the heart is still relatively low. So this might provide some little boost, but it's not going to swamp out the deoxygenated blood coming from the systemic tissues, right? So it's still very beneficial in many animals for that blood to then perfuse across the gills and become reoxygenated, okay? And I kind of like to picture this in terms of, it's also almost as if, you take this circulatory diagram and you kind of pull a piece out of it, right, and insert the air-breathing organ there. So here's another circuitry diagram for fish that use their gut as an air-breathing organ, right? And in this case, then the gut is going to be receiving blood that has already perfused across the gills. So it's partially oxygenated. It's going to travel across the gut, right, be reoxygenated, and that blood is going to mix again with the deoxygenated blood returning from the systemic tissues and passing through the heart. So this seems a little funky, and it might make you ask a number of questions. One of those questions might be, well, is this really a good idea? And there's no great answer to that question. Physiologists will debate, what matters the most to the fish. Does it really matter that the fish's heart is getting enough oxygen, or does it matter more that oxygen reaches systemic tissues? So depending on what you think is more important, you could argue that this circuitry is either good or bad, but I don't think there's really a clear resolution to that question. Now we're going to get into another arrangement which is even more wild and found in a subgroup of fish known as the lungfish. So this is a circuitry diagram from your textbook. And we'll start out down here at the heart, evaluating kind of what happens down here at the heart. Basically what will happen is, so lungfish have a developed lung organ, and that blood from the lung, right, so from their air-breathing organ, will travel right back to the left atrium of the lungfish heart, okay? So here it is, straight back to the heart. All right. In the meantime, these fish also have a sinus venosus. So that sinus venosus with the systemic venous blood, right, deoxygenated, sinus venosus connects back to the right side of the atrium, right? So I've got the left side of the atrium on the bottom, right side on the top of this slide, okay? If we look at output from this heart, what you'll notice is there's some output and some arteries that don't pass through the gills, right? So this differs from everything we've seen so far. Now we've got some blood bypassing the gills and traveling out to the systemic parts of the circulatory system, okay? And from a bunch of functional studies, you can imagine how involved these experiments are. Basically, we've determined that there's very limited mixing of the oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the heart, okay? So when you're thinking about this, think about, laminar flow forces and viscosity, right? Those can favor fluid movement forward over, equal mixing when within the heart, right? So there's not mixing. And that is despite the fact that there are no physical barriers separating the left and right side of the lungfish heart. So these provide a huge potential advantage to the lungfish in that there's also a couple of control points in this whole system that allow the lungfish to only pass blood through their lungs when it's useful for them to do so. So these guys are intermittent breathers. And if we take a close look at the circulatory diagram, you'll notice this deoxygenated blood coming from the sinus venosus passing through the heart and to the gills. So when it becomes oxygenated, it passes through this region where there's a conducting artery called the ductus. And there's also an area here, the pulmonary vasomotor segment, that contains smooth muscle that can either contract or relax to either direct blood through the pulmonary artery towards the lung or direct blood more towards the dorsal aorta and through the tissues, right? So if this lungfish is hanging out underwater, it doesn't really have a reason to pass blood through its lung because it's not going to be able to reoxygenate that blood. So it will experience some constriction of this pulmonary vasomotor segment that'll be constricted, and the blood circulating through its tissues will then generally pass across the gills before heading through the tissues, with some blood flow bypassing the gills altogether and winding up back in circulation. Okay. So here's just another hand-drawn cartoon of this, just highlighting some of the major factors involved, right? So we see some features shared in common with other fish circulatory systems. Here we see return from the sinus venosus to the right side of the heart, right? And that when the lungfish is breathing air in addition to engaging in gas exchange with its gills, this deoxygenated blood will head towards the gills. And at the same time, oxygenated blood coming from the lung will remain on the left side of the lungfish heart. And that blood will basically bypass the gills and head into the systemic circuit. So this will help to augment oxygenation of the tissues when the lungfish is breathing air. Okay, so that brings us through the fish. Up next, we'll take a look at non-bird amphibians and reptiles.